At that time, we were still living outside the town. It was only afterwards that we moved into it, and I, who had always been accustomed to solitude, felt the whole world close in on me as soon as we entered the town. The only times I've been able to breathe freely, ever since, were when I was able to get out of it. And again, as soon as I came back, as soon as the streets and alleys shrank in on me as I crossed the bridge, I shrank too. I always had the impression, and I still have, and always shall have, that behind every window there was at the very least one pair of eyes watching me. If anyone spoke to me, I blushed, because I felt uncomfortably aware that there was something about me that disturbed and upset everybody. 3 months ago, I slashed my wrists, and on the face of it, I had no reason to do such a thing. But I did have a reason, and I knew what it was, and I was only afraid that everyone who looked at me was guessing at what that reason could be. Hence these eyes behind every window.
Hey there, this is David. Welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. On this episode, Nick, Nathan, and I are talking about Bohumil Hrabal's 1965 novel, Closely Watched Trains. This is a wonderful novel, and in its mere 85 pages, Hrabal does a lot. Taking place amidst the chaos and inhumanity of World War II, and containing a final scene of possible heroism, something we get into, the book is surprisingly rooted in the mundane, in the everyday. More than anything, it is a coming-of-age story about Miloš, a young man who works at a provincial railroad station in German-occupied Czechoslovakia, and the idiosyncratic cast of characters that are part of Miloš's life. It's a beautiful little book, and we hope you enjoy it and our discussion of it. So enjoy the talk.
I think it's interesting that this book, it took me a second to figure out what was going on because this book was written in the 60s in Soviet Czechoslovakia, and a lot of the foreword is about kind of the censorship of the author and how this was kind of a censored version of what, I guess it's kind of a version of what he had written previously, but he kind of self-censored in order to get it published. But the book is actually set at the tail end of World War II when Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Germans, which I didn't realize that they were occupied by the Germans and then kind of immediately afterwards occupied by the Soviets. So I don't know, to me that kind of positioned the whole story in kind of this interesting place. And like, is this kind of a commentary on, the state of Czechoslovakia in the 60s under Sovietism through the guise of, this act of heroism and rebellion against the Nazis?
I also made the mistake of reading a foreword first and having it, at least in part at the beginning of the novel, influence how I was reading it. But I kind of abandoned it quickly once I sort of realized what was going on in the book and just sort of went with the narrative of the story itself, which I wouldn't say it's much of a commentary on that. I think it might be slightly when you get to like the characters who tacitly agree to whatever rules are handed down, but at the same time they kind of flaunt them and do whatever they want, and it feels much more like a coming-of-age book than it is anything else.
Mm-hmm. I think the thing that's cool about this with respect to, I guess, the political nature of it, right? So occupation by the Germans, is that it's not this book of pure rebellion. It's a little bit more muted and a little bit more amateur than that. And what I mean by that is that, we have the main character, Miloš, who's not really forceful in anything. Also, the family he came from was not necessarily forceful in anything either. They were kind of known as like taking advantage of whatever came along the way, and very humorous, and kind of, I don't know, just the quirks of it sort of add up to this monumental thing that Miloš does versus the Nazis. But it all just seems kind of a little bit mundane, a little bit in the flow, a little bit funnier than it should be.
Oh, yeah.
Despite how absolutely depressing parts of this are, suicide attempts for one.
Suicide attempts, death around every corner, dying animals, trainloads of wounded soldiers, and yet it's really funny.
Yeah, right. And I think that that's probably what makes this a unique book, is that like it's so absolutely dark, and it is a tale of heroism, but it's also just kind of like plods along and is like a story that you might hear in a bar from a drunk guy.
Yeah, I think in the foreword, it does mention what the story comes from. I think it's like Cain. And then if you've seen the movie, I guess, is similar to the earlier version of the book in that it's told in a very linear fashion from beginning to end, whereas this book, it's really all over the place. And there's no real idea of when things happen, but things are told out of time or out of sequence. And like, especially the suicide, that quote that you read, Nick, at the beginning, it's at the very beginning of the book, but you don't really know why he tried to kill himself exactly. Like, you don't really know the whole situation until much later in the novel. And I think part of that sort of non-sequential order helps give it that, like you were saying, like a tail in a bar. You're kind of catching up to this narrative as you just are given it rather quickly.
It's an interesting way to tell this story because there's this Nazi occupation, but everybody's interests are much closer at hand. They're trying to not work very hard at the job. They're trying to, the station master is involved with his pigeons, the dispatcher's trying to sleep with all the girls. And then the Nazi soldiers just kind of like are passing through this town on the train. And I think when, kind of the first thing that really happens in the story, I think, is he gets taken by the soldiers on the train. The occupation is a real thing, and it interrupts all of these, whatever else that these people are doing in their lives. But even that's told in such a way that it doesn't seem like it's this huge event. Everybody just kind of like seems to shrug it off. And I wasn't super clear because they kind of like insinuate some thing that some alert from the Third Reich or something, and then the soldiers take Miloš away on the train. But what was it that he was taken away for?
I also have this question, so David, you fill us in.
I didn't think it was anything in particular. I think it was just the fact that he was there. And the warning that they got was that these soldiers were moving along and that they shot up, I think, another station or something, if I remember correctly. And I think they were just on a rampage coming back because they were returning from the front line. Is that right? Or was that a different train of
I thought
soldiers?
I thought that was a different train, but...
And maybe this train was heading towards it, so maybe they were just ramping up their bloodlust. I'm not sure, but I'm with you. I don't remember a very specific reason. It was just the story was moving along, and then all of a sudden our narrator's talking about how he's got guns poking into his ribs, and they're just pushing him onto the train. Mm-hmm. That scene that is kind of, I don't know how you would describe it, where he's on the train. It seems like he's about to be murdered. And then because an older SS leader, I don't know I can't remember what he calls him, not a general, but whatever, sort of sees the scars on his wrists, calls him a comrade, and then lets him go.
Yeah, it seemed to be kind of just like an acknowledgement that, hey, this guy that we're about to kill is kind of already in a rough spot anyway, so what are we doing here? Like it almost sort of felt like that moment sort of beautiful because it kind of, I don't know, almost like, I don't want to say took the agency away, but like you're right, like the prior station, I think they mentioned like spraying bullets into it, right? So they're obviously losing the war and they're just basically destroying some stuff as they go. But they get to this point where they realize that here's this person who's already tried to destroy themselves. So what are we doing here? That's kind of what I read into it as. That's just like, and he says comrade, and that's, in the foreword, they criticize this moment as being a thing that humanitizes it, which I think is probably correct. But I also think that that's like Hrabal in a nutshell, is that he always, in some of his other books, takes like pretty rough situations, makes them funny, and then has this underlying humanity to it that sort of makes you feel somehow warm on the inside when thinking about some really not great circumstances. And so whether or not that's appropriate or people were critical in the time and, when the book showed up is its whole own thing. But it kind of is this unifying aspect of like, yeah, look how shitty your life is under occupation. But also at the same time, look at how much life still goes on under your occupation. people still have these concerns that, like, the number one thing Miloš cares about is not the Germans. He just wants to get laid.
Yeah, he doesn't want to wilt like a lily.
Yeah, and in the moment he has it, the whole thing goes south, right? And so I think there's something super poetic about that, where we assume that, like, when you're under authoritarian rule and stuff, that people's lives don't go on, but they 100% do. We're doing the same shenanigans. And so that's not like apologizing or saying that this doesn't matter. But I think it's a fine line to walk, is like, even in moments of political mess and, upheaval, people still want to lose their virginity. And it's a big deal.
All right, well, that wraps it up.
That whole conversation just wilted like a lily. So one thing I noticed is that, we read the quote at the beginning, but it's hard to pull quotes out of this. Like, a lot of books that we love kind of have these like aphoristic moments where there's just a great line or two that like explains everything. But it's really hard to like split any of this up. It just all flows. It all seems important, but it's not necessarily like quotable. But at the same time, I think the prose is fantastic. I don't know. What do you guys make of that aspect?
I wonder if it's the protagonist is kind of detached, and maybe, be partly because of his suicide attempt or his sort of bleak outlook, or he comes from this family of slackers who aren't really super engaged with things anyway. And so the storyline kind of floats along like this too. He's not one to make aphoristic, objective claims about what's going on. It's just more banal. So I had the same problem. I didn't highlight anything.
Yeah, the things I marked were all just little moments that revealed character. Is kind of where you get, not necessarily passages that are beautiful or poetic, but just how well he captures these characters in this concealed world. As you guys have already mentioned, we've talked about the story is just kind of like this rambling, contained narrative, almost like a play. Like, everything happens more or less at the station house. And the scenes that don't happen there are also very, like, humorous. The whole thing at the uncle's photography studio is great. And then the opening scenes of the book where all the locals are gutting this crashed plane. And then he talks about his great-grandfather, the 2 packs of smokes and a bottle of rum guy. And then his grandfather, the magician.
The hypnotist.
The hypnotist, that's right.
Yeah.
Other than like those 2 scenes, and I guess the third scene the scene where you actually commit suicide at the hotel, or attempts suicide, everything is contained inside the station house. So it just feels very, like this just rambling sort of nonchalant narrative. And that's, I think, at first a little odd because there's all this chaos around them. And you hear about it, and even when he was at the uncle's house, there was a massive bombing that blew off the studio, and it was still like, but the way he tells it is, it's so distant from any sort of pain or horror, and because he's so wrapped up in what happened the night before, that I think it adds that sort of humorous distance. Like, he's more worried about the fact that he can't please a woman, and yet the walls literally have been blown up around him. Sorry, I went on a rambling rant there.
That's like a humorous take, but I also think to some degree that's just 100% accurate. I don't know how old Miloš is in this, but
22, I think.
Like 7? Oh, okay, early 20s. I feel like in the film he looks like just a boy, but has colored my perception already. But like, when you're younger, you don't really feel responsible for like the bigger things sometimes, or they just feel like they're out of your control. Even if you think you're capable of influencing them, like your world at hand is so much more important. I don't know. And I think that's a great take on youth. And I think it also sets up the question of, to what degree is he actually a hero? Did his feat at the end, was that him actively deciding to do something against the Germans? Or was he just on cloud 9 after finally doing the deed?
Does motivation matter when you call it a deed heroic?
This is an argument my girlfriend and I were having after watching the film last night. And I was like, he is a hero because look at what he did. And she's like, well, I didn't feel that he really cared whether he did it. And so I'm on one side of it. I'm curious because like he feels passive in that moment, or almost like, after he and Victoria Fry have their moment of lovemaking, I think he even says something like, oh, I've never felt more relaxed than this. I felt more like a man than I ever have, right? And so it just kind of, I don't know, it doesn't feel like an active decision that he made. But still, I do agree with you. It doesn't necessarily make him less of a hero whether or not he's engaged in it, because he still did it.
I would say the act itself is certainly heroic. Whether or not he is a hero is debatable.
I think Hrabal further kind of like muddies the distinction because Miloš doesn't fully comprehend, I think, what he's doing until after he's dropped the bomb. Should we stop being coy and just say what the thing is that he did? And there's a train going through with lots of ammunition for the front, and he climbs up on some kind of sign at the railway station and drops a bomb into it and blows it up and gets shot in the process. But as he's lying there in the ditch with the German soldier, there's kind of this like shared humanity. And it's like, what is heroism? Like, he blew up this thing, and, I think you could probably easily project like what the news story is going to be about what happened. He's clearly a hero and did a heroic thing. But Hrabal places it, kind of that whole deed, with him lying in the ditch with this German soldier, both of them dying, and just like their life going out. And is that really heroic?
I mean, Miloš does take the extra steps of shooting the guy, I think an additional 2 times, right?
Yeah. Once in the heart, didn't work. And then
once through the eye. And just because he wanted his damn boots to stop moving, as the German guy who shot is just over there kind of marching incessantly.
At first, I didn't understand it. I thought he was literally standing and marching. But then, as I read it, I understood he was like lying down and his feet were just marching. And so it was like making this grating sound. He's like, fucking shut up, man. I'm trying to die over here. And then, he just couldn't take it anymore. And then after killing him, has this, oh, hey, you're still a human, I guess. Let me hold your hand. And it's very strange. And then the closing line is also funny.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to...
What is it? You should have left your arse at home.
You should have sat at home on your arse. Yeah.
On your arse.
Yeah. But yeah, he recognized that this man has this charm that brought him no luck. And he imagined him calling out not to his actual mother, but to the mother of his children. And there was this empathy with him, even though he wanted to kill him and did kill him.
It's an interesting tone that he strikes throughout this whole book, because it's like this, it's tragic, it's humorous, it's absurd, it's dark.
I think it's because Miloš is so naive that it colors everything about the narrative and gives you that distance from the horrors of what was going on around him. And because he's so naive and obsessed with just his own little bubble of the world, it makes it, I guess, like Nick or maybe Nathan, I can't remember who, was saying, just more mundane and banal and everyday than you would expect from a novel set in occupied Czechoslovakia during World War II that ends in an act of explosive heroism. You would think the novel would be more serious.
And this is where I wonder if, thinking about the context in which it's written, if it's subversive in a way, because, that act of heroism in that moment and other acts of heroism eventually led to an occupation by a different occupying force, a different kind of totalitarianism. So I can't help but imagine that him writing this, it's kind of like, what is the story? Like, what is the grand narrative here? I think as Americans, it's easier to look back at World War II and an act of heroism, led to a defeat of the Nazis and the freedom of France and, the freedom of much of Europe from Nazi control. So we could say like, oh yeah, that was heroic. But if you're Czechoslovakia and then like after the war, you just got occupied by somebody else who then doesn't allow you to criticize what they're doing. Maybe this is kind of like an underhanded way of saying like, you know what, you're not heroic either. There's no grand narrative driving this Soviet train either.
Yeah, I think it removes, that sequence of history removes this like nice clean cut good and evil narrative that, we love our stories to fit into. And I think by keeping this in this weird middle ground between completely banal and heroic and funny and depressing and just sort of refusing to be pulled in one direction, that he is actually giving legitimate humanity to, living in Czechoslovakia. He's refusing to say that like the only thing that matters to us is defeating, the enemy. Refusing to say that like you own us. He's basically like still trying to keep like the things that make us actually identifiable humans to each other, like our interactions with each other, our pains, our sufferings, our humor. And I think it feels super unique in that because a lot of World War II fiction, especially through like, the American lens, is just all about defeating the enemy. And even if it's critical, it still gets that structure and benefits from it, right? But I think that like that's just the way it's going to be if you're viewing it through like the classic like American lens. But you're right, Nathan. Like if the end of the war didn't actually change anything for your country, or rather change it in an equally bad way, then what is the narrative? Nobody won. Nobody. It's just life goes on. You have to keep what you can control, essentially.
Then why, if you agree with that, Nick, why would you call what he did heroic?
Ooh, good question. Because I think you always blow up Nazi trains.
Okay, that's the correct answer.
Yeah. How many Nazi trains have you blown up? Yeah.
Just 5, 6,
Yeah, well, I guess my argument or angle on that is that it absolutely is heroic, but by keeping this middle ground, it keeps it from being the end all be all of everything. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, confusing to us as readers who are so used to that. And so when the story doesn't deliver it, you're just like, wait, did he just like destroy like a huge Nazi train full of ammunition? Why does it seem so banal? I guess, the more we talk about it, that's what's so hard and confusing about this is if you were to summarize this story, it seems like a big sweeping drama. I don't know, that like would tie nicely into this like grand saga thing. But then you hear the story and it's, it's like a clever storytelling drunk uncle.
Yeah. If you haven't read it, it's less than 90 pages. Like, so all of this is happening in a very short amount of time. And the act of heroism is the last 5, 10 pages at the most. The book is much more concerned with the station master's pigeons, his precious couch, the way... I really like the station master, so I want to talk about him. Because I find him he's such a great character. He's such a great character.
Yeah.
And he's just like this bumbling comic relief guy who's also kind of sweet, but also I think Miloš talks about how the station master, he goes up to his sort of loft or whatever it is and yells through the vents about the downfall of of youth and their obsession with sex and all this other horrible stuff, because it's the only way he can keep sane, to let this demon out by just screaming through the vents.
And that's how he like prevents himself from yelling at his wife. I think that was in
Yeah. Or he does yell at his wife occasionally, and she will from time to time throw something at him or hit him in the face with like a piece of fish or whatever is lying around. And he's like, "Oh shit, all right, yeah, my bad." And then he goes back to being his normal, weird, somewhat dandy-like self in his office. He has all this really nice, ornate furniture that he's obsessed with, which gets torn repeatedly through acts of intercourse by the, what's his name again?
Dubishka.
Yeah.
That's just the sex couch of the station, apparently. But I like that, like the screaming thing, because I feel a kinship to that. And one of the things I've missed about pandemic life is, I never would have said this, but I miss driving in my car to work, Because quite frankly, like a couple times a year, I will literally scream to myself in my car. And that helps. That like offloads it somewhere. Just like whatever mundane bullshit that like destroys you on the inside. It's really hard to find a place to scream in life. You can't scream in your house. Can't scream in your office. Like people look at you. But like we're all just full of this bullshit. And just knowing that somebody else had devised this system of screaming in order to offload it, I was like, yeah, I get you. And then you sort of present yourself back and you're like a happy individual. It's smart. Well, I also just want to talk about the whole stamps on the butt thing.
Oh, yeah.
Gotta talk about the stamps on the butt.
Yeah. I guess the womanizer, Dubischka, and the typist also just being, I guess the situation is they're bored and there's a little bit of sexual tension, and they spend the evening with him seductively planting all of the station stamps on her behind. And then the next morning, her mom gets real mad about that and just basically parades her around so everybody sees the stamps on her butt, and they want him to go to jail or something, but she's like, let him do it.
Well, yeah, like the fact that the mother is horrified by the act and yet parades her around so that everyone can look at the stamps on her child's behind is very amusing. And I like that Hrabal doesn't take away agency from the typist either. She's like, yeah, I wanted him to do it. I thought, or she has a line like, I wanted to see what would happen or something. And of course, the station master is like greedily writing down word for word what she's like, let me get this down. He's writing it down in his little notebook. It's the whole thing is very, very funny.
Yeah, and they like there's a comment in it that everybody was sort of basically like criticizing and like against Dubischka, when in reality he was the only one that had the confidence to do what they wanted to do.
I think I can't remember who it is. I think there's a castle, in whatever this village is, that has a duke and a duchess. It's like the equivalent in English. I don't know what they are. And he gets invited up. Dubischka gets invited up. It's like passed along like, oh, by the way, the duke said, oh, I can't believe you did this. I'm so proud of you. I have so much respect for you. You should come up to the castle sometime.
Yeah, I think it's funny that that's actually the majority of the book. Really not the war stuff.
Yeah, most of the book is about this.
Sounds like a very sexy time. That's all I gotta say.
I also enjoyed the station master's pigeon coop.
Yeah,
and how after the Germans invaded, he got rid of all of his
Nuremberg.
Yeah, his Nuremberg pigeons.
They were Nurembergs. Yeah. Right, when the Germans invaded Poland, he replaced the Nurembergs with was it like Polish silver points or something? Some Polish themed bird. I mean, isn't that what we all do? None of our actions actually influence like global wars and whatnot. We're all just floating around trying to use the station's love couch. That's all.
Nathan?
I was looking for there was, if I recall, some head honcho of the train service comes.
Oh yeah.
And nobody recognizes him.
Quick correction. Count and Countess, not Duke and Duchess. Fucking hell.
You're way off.
Way off.
The station master comes out with all the pigeons on his shoulders and stuff. I was just looking for that scene.
Something like Lebecki
like
or something?
Bird shit.
Or are you talking about Counselor Zednicek? And there's that weird line about how his nephew or his son, they removed the Czech from their name so it sounds more German so that they can have an in with the Germans. Something like that. Is that what you're talking about?
I think that's in the same scene.
Oh, yeah. Just like his father, Boleslav Zednicek didn't know the German language properly and had recommended himself to the Germans by excising the Czech accents from his names. I don't know why I noted that line. Just a little like random one-off thing about how some of the Czech people were they would do these small things to ingratiate themselves with the occupying force.
Yeah, there's another line on the next page. Counselor Zednicek was standing at the window. There goes our hope, our youth, to fight for a free Europe. And what do you get up to here? You print stamps on the telegraphists behind. Which I thought he's talking about the Nazis, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, his whole thing is, he's trying to speak of the Nazis as the ones who are basically saving Europe.
Yeah.
That took me a little while to piece together too. I was like, wait, I see.
Yeah, he's a collaborator.
But there's kind of an interesting dynamic there too of like this grand narrative that he's concocted or that he's bought into of Nazis freeing Europe. And what did you get up to here? You just stamped the telegraph is behind. And the book, I think, by making so much of the story about this semi-scandalous event of stamping the telegraph is behind, is kind of saying that that's more of the grand narrative. These like weird, mundane occurrences, the sexual tension is real. That's the grand narrative. While all the boys are out there shooting each other up.
Yeah, I think if you also kind of view that through just the trend or the standard for literature under socialist or communist regimes, it's always trying to have some sort of political force to it, socialist realism or communist realism, that kind of thing, where basically you need to write fiction that continues to uphold the party behaviors. And so when this book showed up in, is it 60s, right? 60s Czechoslovakia? They mentioned that this is kind of when some of these censorship things and limitations to art were kind of starting to loosen up a little bit. And so this book, I think, Nathan, you kind of called it subversive in a way. I think that aspect, that, again, giving more weight to these small things and less weight to any type of, grand political heroism, stuff like that, is sort of rebelling against this concept of art being co-opted in the first place.
Yeah.
Which I think, like all societies, I mean, we have problems with that in America, right? Like a lot of fiction that's produced is supposed to now be sort of the correct thing. And like we have, systems in place to kind of like propagate these types of correct fiction, right? And no, it's not as much as like a socialist or communist regime, for sure.
I mean, it's not state sanctioned, but it is just culturally agreed upon.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you get outside that, you kind of hit, these sort of, almost like a tunnel-like barrier, right? That keeps you back in the center. And so in some ways, like, I think like rebellion through the mundane and rebellion through like these small little like sexual and scandalous situations is kind of, it's more badass than it seems when you place it in that spot in history, because it's really just, it feels delightful when you're reading it.
Yeah.
You're like, why is this so fun? But realizing that like everybody just missed that, like they didn't have that in their art for, like 2 decades.
I think knowing that context is really important to reading the book, because as soon as I came across socialist realism, I was like, wow, I used to know what that means. I don't remember anymore. Let me look this up real quick. Oh yeah, okay. And then seeing how, like, the foreword sort of talks about how people viewed this book in relation to its earlier version more than how it dealt with censorship in the time. But I think knowing that context of a tradition of socialist realism in all forms of art that really only served to uplift a very particular narrative, and if it were to show people living sort of mundane lives, then it was only to valorize them as these perfect proletariat fake people that don't really exist, to uplift or to promote whatever form of ism that needs to be promoted at the time. And yeah, this book doesn't do that at all. Like the people, I think opening especially with his sort of family's history of laziness is really interesting because it's like the exact opposite of what you would come across in socialist realist fiction.
Yeah.
There's a dude who, he gets his free gold coin every day, and then he buys his tobacco and his bottle of booze, and then sits around and makes fun of the workers.
Yeah. After he served for like 30 seconds or whatever,
he got hit by a brick and was like, oh shit, I can't move. Or whatever. And
then he continues. Yeah. And he just flaunts it so much that he gets beat up constantly, but he can't stop flaunting it. Yeah, no, I mean, that's so perfect, right? Because, even in like, American fiction, there's this whole, like independence and this, the Protestant work ethic stuff, like, work hard. And even if it's outside of like your classic, like making money stuff, you're still supposed to work hard and you're still supposed to make art and you're still supposed to do this stuff, right?
Got to bootstrap, got to hustle.
His whole thing, his whole family chain is just about exploiting the system and slacking as much as possible.
Yeah.
And that's the heroism, actually. That's the real event. It's not blowing up the Nazi train.
But then his father is someone that actually did work, but he started working so young, and he worked at a job that was relatively easy, but he was able to just retire early, and he did. It's not like he was like, you know what, I'm still young, I can still put in the work. It's like, no, I did my time. Now I'm just going to chill and do as little as possible.
Life goals.
So what are some of the other characteristics of socialist realism? Because kind of my understanding, pretty limited, but it was just about kind of presenting the rosiest version of this any given story that points to the advancement and progress of humanity towards this socialist utopia. Is there more to it than that, or is that basically it?
I mean, I think you summarized it very well. It kind of tees up the question of, I don't have a whole lot of socialist realism to point to, but, we did read, kind of from the flip side, we did read that Eileen Chang book a while ago that was essentially paid propaganda against Mao and the revolution over there. And we were discussing whether or not a state-sanctioned book could actually be good. Can it be both? And so I was thinking about that with respect to socialist realism, which is like, are there books of that, funding foundation, right? Are there paid-for books that actually were written super well and good and still establish these like fundamental tenets of like what you said, kind of upholding these themes and whatnot, but are they also good? And I don't know the answer to that. Maybe that's a homework thing. But I'm curious, like everybody who existed as somebody who would basically make state-funded art, there's probably different camps, right? Like people who are doing it to a T, but then people are also doing it and trying to see how much they can get away with. And that's what I'm curious, like in these eras, how much stuff was like right on the edge and still snuck by. I don't have an answer to that. But there's certainly, decades of it to pour through. I just don't know where to start.
The fact that the three of us are fairly well read and we haven't come across one yet is a slight indication that there might not be a lot of good out there. I'm sure there's got to be at least a few, just by pure numbers. But the fact that not one has reached us seems to indicate that maybe not a lot of them were good. Because I think the very fact of the artistic temperament, the person that wants to create good art, got to be very hard to be told you can only do this or you can only do that and still create something worth reading.
Yeah, but I kind of wonder, like we always think of these governments as being incredibly authoritarian, and I wonder if it was almost socially enforced too.
I'm sure.
Like a little more subtle of simply like, yeah, you can write what you want, but like there will be consequences if you don't fit into the right thing.
Or it's not published at all.
Yeah, it just gets buried. And so I wonder how different those mechanisms are versus, our own mechanisms that we have today that sort of kind of influence the general, like the median book, if you will, right? Because
just popped into my head, there are state-sponsored, everything was state-sponsored for a lot of this stuff, especially during the Soviet Union. So I know, like, early Tarkovsky films, those are considered like Russian films. But whether or not they fit some sort of like checklist. Am I wrong about that? At least his first couple.
No, I think you're right. Certainly like the era, the ages of them.
Interesting.
Fit square within that time period.
But I don't know if you would call that socialist realism. I think socialist realism is a very specific thing, not necessarily approved by the state. It's guided by the state, right? Mm. That's my understanding of it. I think there's a distinction between approved by and fitting some sort of guideline.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wonder. It's a very interesting topic because I think, and Nick, you alluded to this, like we're not free from this, and maybe no society, is, and every society's attempting to make some kind of art. But I think of like the Apple streaming service, for instance, and they had they were very upfront. They wanted to make good content. And I thought, there's no way you can make good content and also, good ethically sound, whatever. They wanted to be a force for good with the content they're making. And I was pretty skeptical, but they've made some entertaining stuff with their guidelines. And I'm sure they have guidelines for creators to work within. It's an interesting.
Did they release that documentary about how their products are made? Sorry, that was a bad joke. When you said Apple and ethically good, I laughed inside. Because what a load of shit.
Now we're never getting this podcast published. Fucking thanks.
Sorry. Shouldn't have brought it up.
Sorry.
All hail Apple.
I mean, Hrabal plays around with this in his other books too. If you've taken a crack at Too Loud a Solitude, which is just the most enjoyable. Have either of you guys read that?
No,
book?
This is the first one I've read.
Yeah, it's equally short, but it's his condensed hit. But it's basically, it's about kind of an older gentleman who's maybe not necessarily mentally, I don't know, he's not necessarily super sharp or smart, but he's essentially like a paper compactor. And he basically just exists in this hole, and just paper gets thrown down on him, and books and things, and he basically creates compacted chunks of paper, I guess, to ship them off somewhere. But he ends up being incredibly well read, and he has this huge love of literature, and he creates themed versions of these packs of just compacted paper. And so it's really just this easy story about a love of literature and art and the written word. But then towards the end, the socialist regime has kind of decided that they can optimize this. They got better machines. They can put these young tan workers in charge of it. They can have a much higher throughput, and the whole thing will just be more efficient and better for everyone. And so this kind of older man with this true love of art just essentially is passed by for this more efficient set of gears that nobody will ever think to make a themed cube of trash ever again based on the written word. It just gets crushed under the apparatus.
That's the one piece of literature about Soviet efficiency.
Actually, now I wonder when that came out with respect to censorship, because Hrabal, this book that we're talking about, Closely Watched Trains, the 60s, but it wasn't an even thing. I think I was reading that he had to make some allegiances to certain governments, and that was a stressful situation, and some of his books would go in and out of censorship, and this wasn't just a clean thing that yes, now it's open. I think it was an ongoing thing throughout his career to figure out to what level can you placate these things, these bounds, I suppose, versus to what degree of honesty do you still get to keep in your work, right? And so I think that's not a linear thing at all.
Yeah.
Anything else of note? I enjoyed the super short O. Henry-like narrative about the girl with the boots next to him in the hospital.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
it
yeah.
Was really depressing and dark, and yet I don't know how he does this, but there's a lot of really dark imagery in this book, and yet it's somehow in my head still remains fairly light.
Yeah.
That one image of the starving cattle, and they've punctured through the floor of the train car. There's a lot of that.
Wait, so that was funny to you?
No, I didn't.
That one was not funny.
I'm saying these things aren't funny, and yet the book, in my as a whole, feels like a rather sort of light narrative in many ways.
Yeah.
There's a number of images like that are about things getting cut off.
Yeah. I mean, the grandfather's head by the tank.
The grandfather's head in the tank. The girl's feet in the boots. Interesting. All of those images make me very uncomfortable.
The cattle and the little girl in the bed next to him in the hospital were really particularly fucked up.
But yet you should read it because it's enjoyable. And makes you feel warm on the inside somehow.
Hey, y'all both...
Just don't tell anybody about it because they'll think you're crazy.
Y'all both watched the film, which I just watched the trailer and the opening scene. How does that relate, or how does that compare to the book?
So, like I said, the film is told in a sort of linear fashion with him just starting up to his heroic act. There are very small differences in a few scenes that are not told, but it's fairly accurate. It was written by Hrabal. Like, he wrote the script with the director.
I do think there's one important distinction between the film and the book that actually plays into the whole discussion of, like, to what level was Miloš actually a hero. And that at the end, in the book, he takes the bomb and a gun, and then when he throws the bomb down, basically him and the German guy shoot each other, and then get that whole thing where eventually he ends up shooting the German soldier twice just to get him to stop marching with his boots. But in the film, basically as soon as Miloš drops the bomb in the train, there's a German soldier who just shoots Miloš.
Yeah.
And then he falls into the train. And then, after however many, minute or two, then he gets blown up with the whole train. So it actually makes him seem even more passive than in the book. The book kind of has that end decision where he, after they've shot each other, he finishes it. But in the film, it just sort of seemed like a whoops-a-daisy kind of moment. Like, oh, dropped the bomb in, and then, ended up getting blown up with it.
In the film, I believe, I don't think this is true in the book, but in the film, Hubishka? Man, I can never remember that guy's name. In the film, he's being interrogated about the whole butt stamp situation, and he was the one who was supposed to drop the bomb. So Miloš sees he can't do it, so he goes and grabs the bomb and does it for him. Whereas in the book, I don't think that is the situation.
Yeah, they kind of overlap those scenes in the film. Yeah, you're totally right about that. Which is funny. That almost seems like it gives more agency to Miloš.
Yeah.
So
there's a balance, I think, made.
Overall, I think the film is great. It's not, again, it's sort of just like the book, like for something that is this tale of quote unquote good and evil, occupied forces, and society living under them. It's still super light. It's not like a lot of like the voiceovers are this really like even cadence of kind of fast moving Czech.
Yeah.
It's almost like hard to read the subtitles in that same speed because it just went so fast. And that feels like, how this narrator, like the novel, actually passes by. You can just get in this stream and it just flows. And so, yeah, Nathan, you should, at the very least, watch the trailer again.
I think it also helps visualize a lot of the outdated tech related to this job that's mentioned in the book. It's talking about like the different signals and like a teletypist. Why is there a teletypist? Like, you don't really understand, or at least I didn't, reading the book really. I had a hard time visualizing a lot of it because it's just outdated technology and don't really know much about how train signals work. So, seeing it in a film, which even though I think the film is a little different because in the book there's lights associated with it, right?
Yeah.
But I think in the film it's sort of old school signals.
There's also kind of just like, I feel like this is many authors, and Hrabal is one of them, just a skepticism that essentially added technology is going to make anything better. And I think like you get a sense for that in some of his other books, but it's also just like, we've added all this technology, but we haven't really gotten away from some of these like universal truths. And so it's funny placing that and seeing all this archaic technology and just realizing that, yeah, we still have the same problems. There's still people trying to oppress others. There's still quiet acts of rebellion. There's still mundane things. Doesn't matter whether or not your train signals are run with like 1940s technology or automated by a Python script. It's all still got the same problems. Humans aren't going away.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, make sure to rate and review us on iTunes. Throw us a comment on YouTube or give us a follow on Twitter or Instagram at BooksOSubstance. Until next time.
Humans aren't going away.